Been asked today to give. Okay. So, hi all. I've been asked today to give a description about how to deal with summary statement comments when you get your grants back. And so, today's presentation is going to be on an introduction to writing a revised application and how do you productively address these criticisms of your grant. Also, Rob Akins is here, and I'm sure he can chime in if he wants to add any additional input. That would be great.
I'd be happy.
Okay, so just from the standpoint of thinking about this, is that the reason that this becomes an issue is that you already have submitted to a granting agency and you have received a score and as well as grant critiques. Now, this is only, there's an awful lot of foundations and an awful lot of mechanisms where you'll actually never get grant critiques. In other cases, that how you deal with grant critiques will really be variable depending on what that granting mechanism is. In some cases, it's there for you to submit an entirely new application. That there are a lot of granting agencies where you don't actually acknowledge your revised application, you're just submitting a new application. So a lot of my comments here will be based on the idea of an NIH revised application, where they have very specific rules where you can do one revised application, and that that revised application has an introduction page that is 1 page long. However, a lot of the themes that I'm going to be talking about are also true for other granting mechanisms. So, and I think that the biggest thing about rebutting a grant review really comes down to dealing with this yourself emotionally. Because after you have gotten your grant reviews, I mean, essentially you've put in a huge amount of emotional and intellectual effort. And when you don't get that grant funded, it basically is the emotional equivalent of somebody telling you that your baby is ugly and worthless. And it is a really tough thing. But the key here is that you have to manage your emotions. The biggest mistake that people make is that when they get a negative grant score, that grant will never see the light of day. It basically comes back to you and you put it in the dust drawer and you never even think about it again. And that can be the least productive of all of the things that one can do here. And one of the reasons that this is such an emotionally charged issue is that, I mean, of course, nobody likes to be criticized. Also, it's really the product of months or years of your intellectual effort. And you probably put in your very best effort for the application. And anybody telling you your best effort is not good enough because you got a poor score is a really tough thing to internalize. And even though from the time you started doing research, our business is all about constant criticism, it doesn't make it any easier to receive. Also, it's not just about your intellectual situation very often. It's also that getting a grant at times can make or break your career. And depending on what your funding is like and how your salary is being funded, it can also make or break your next paycheck. So you also have the entire emotional thing related to, can I even do this job anymore? As well as, can I pay my next bill? So that the negative grant score can engender really major anxieties. And it's not just for your personal situation. I know in my personal situation, fortunately, most of my salary is pretty secure in my current job, but I get a large amount of anxiety because of the situation of the employees and students that are working for me. And a much larger situation when I have a bad grant score is I'm worried about whether I can keep my staff, whether my students can actually graduate. So you have to understand why this is so upsetting. And you have to be able to step back here, because until you can, you're not going to be able to move forward after you've gotten a negative grant result. And in some ways, getting a bad grant score or even getting a paper rejected really involves a grieving process. And, these are the 5 stages of grief that social scientists talk about when you lose a loved one. But it's really the same thing that happens when you receive a bad grant score. And I know I have gone through all of these stages. One is denial and isolation. That is that you don't want to tell anybody else you got a bad grant score because you are worried people are going to think less of you. Also, you just don't want to have that conversation because you're very emotional and you're very upset. Also, you go through anger, and that's how dare the damn reviewers say that my proposal was inadequate. And this is the part where people really say that, oh, the grant reviewers are unfair, they're stupid, they're biased, they're an old boys network, or they're out to get me for a reason X, Y, Z, P, Q. And while I am not denying that all of those things have not happened, it is actually extraordinarily rare. And that 99% of the time, none of those things are true about why you got a bad grant score. But until it's easier to be angry and blame the reviewer than it is to really self-reflect about what's going on. And so that's a really, really important part of the process to get through. You also go through the bargaining phase, and it's that, oh, the deck is stacked against me. And I will tell you that every single group that writes grants feels the deck's stacked against them. New investigators feel that established investigators have all the cards. Senior investigators feel that new investigators are getting unwarranted legs up because they get a boost in their priority scores about getting funded. That research in this area is being discriminated against for whatever reason. The granting mechanisms are stacked against innovative ideas. These are all excuses, and there could be some truth to these things, but again, it's not a very productive way to go forward. And then people go through depression. There's no point in resubmitting because it's not reviewed fairly, or that if it's self-internalized, I don't belong in science, it's hopeless. I will tell you the only thing that's hopeless is if you don't resubmit or you don't submit a new application. That you will not, the only 100% surety is that if you don't submit applications, they will never be funded. So the best you can do is just go back and be productive here. And then finally go to the point of acceptance. And that's really being able to step back, start to objectively look at the criticisms as constructive, and move on to thinking about a revised application. So that in some ways you then have to go and analyze that problem. And that is figuring out that what the reviewers don't like about your application. That you get your grant score, you get from an NIH grant, you could get between 5 and 10 pages of single-spaced comments, depending on the situation. And so you're trying to figure out, all right, what didn't they like? How can I address those problems? One unfortunate thing that happened with the Reinventing Peer Review initiative that happened about, I guess, 7, 8 years ago now, is that they changed the focus of the reviews. So when I started in science 20 years ago, the reviews were there to help the applicant improve their application, as well as to inform the NIH about which grants were the most meritorious. When they did the Reinventing Peer Review initiative about 8 years ago, that changed. And actually now reviewers are, in fact, discouraged from making suggestions to improve a grant. The reviews are not written to you as the applicant. They are written solely to inform the people at NIH what are the strengths and weaknesses of your proposal and whether or not it should be funded. So that because NIH reviewers are specifically enjoying not to provide constructive criticism, they're there to provide evaluations that are not meant for your eyes, that you have to sometimes read between the lines about what drove those comments and those feelings. So in that situation, you have to realize that those comments are simply there to give a context to the criterion scores. They are not to help you improve your grant. So this means that you're going to probably want to talk to people besides yourself to figure out what's going on here so that you can get some more insight. Now, when you're analyzing this problem, you have to strive for objectivity. This is very, very difficult to do when it's your work. Very often you can clearly see in somebody else's application where the weaknesses are. You can clearly see how the reviews line up to the application. For your own work, it is a really, really difficult thing to do. This is why looking for other investigators in your field to bounce things off of can be really important. However, you have to make sure you never ask somebody who's currently on the study section. That is completely and utterly forbidden. Now, one way to analyze this problem is that take all of the critiques and put them in a word processing program and break them down into each comment and annotate it point by point. You know, even if it's a little throwaway comment, positive or negative, annotate that and write down what you think each of these critiques and comments mean. After you have done that annotation process, then you want to step back and look for that forest among the trees of the detailed comments. And that's because you will not have the opportunity to address the comments point by point. That was another change in the reinventing peer review. In my day, the critique or the response to the revised application was 3 pages single-spaced. That allowed you to largely address most of the major reviewer comments. Now that section's 1 page, which means that you don't have the opportunity to address every critique. You're going to have to look for what the big picture concerns are, what are the major concerns, and address them specifically. That doesn't mean you should ignore the other criticisms, but you might just change those in the body of the grant without pointing out to the reviewer you have changed them. All right, so when you're analyzing this problem, you're looking for the themes that those 3 reviews have in common. Particularly, you want to emphasize anything or comments or concerns that were made by all 3 reviewers, because those are major, because multiple independent experts of the field came to the same conclusions independently. And I want to emphasize that they really were independent. Grant reviews are done in the home institutions. They're done, can be thousands of miles apart for the 3 reviewers. And particularly if your grant is not scored, those critiques are never touched after that. So anything you're reading that all 3 reviewers say is that there's multiple people in the field who feel the same way about your application. Even if there's only 2 that are saying the same thing, it really should be considered. Also, you should look at the criterion scores. So the criterion scores are both, you have your impact score, which is your overall score for the grant, but each criterion score is breaking it down to investigator. If there's a poor criterion score for investigator, these are situations where you really have to see, have you been publishing enough in this area? Or are you considered by the reviewers to be lacking a key piece of expertise that for the reapplication, you better know, you better have brought in an expert to deal with that weakness of you as an investigator. Is there a problem with impact? Is it that did you not convince those reviewers that this was really going to move this field forward? Is there a problem with experimental approach? If all of the 3 reviewers said the experimental approach was weak, that's telling you might be a significant problem in either how you've set up your experimental design or whether your experimental design really addresses the hypotheses or questions you asked. All right. So you then, once you have looked for those common themes that you want to look at, are there issues with the experimental approach? Like I said, as reviewers, they are not allowed to write your grant. So they are really discouraged from telling you what the right experiment is. They can read this grant and say, I think this is the right experiment. They're not doing the right experiment. The reviewers are encouraged to just say it's a poor experimental design. They are not encouraged to tell you what the right experimental design will be. So if you're looking for, so you first have to figure out, is there really an experimental approach problem? And one way to look at this is that, are there poison pill words and poison pills that really kill your experimental approach criterion score? And to be honest, these will largely kill your impact factor, because that is impact factor, right? Impact factor.
The overall impact.
Yeah, overall impact score is because if you look theoretically, there's all of the criterion scores, but NIH has done analyses, and they found that the overall impact score and the experimental approach criteria score have the highest one-to-one correlation. So if you did not get a good score on experimental approach, all of the rest of the scores being high will not help you. So it is really, really important that there is nothing in the experimental approach that bothers the reviewer, because if it does, the rest of the scores aren't going to help you for your final score. And some of these poison pill words are not hypothesis driven. That means is that they just think you're doing stuff for no reason that can be discerned. That if they use the word fatal flaw, I mean, fatal flaw is murderous to your grant score, because that's saying that what you're proposing either won't work or won't answer the question. If they say there's poor experimental design, if they say there's an incremental advance, that is brutal. So they're basically saying is that, yeah, the science is fine, but it's not really going to do much. Naive is a problem, and naive, young investigators will get naive, but to be honest, senior investigators will get naive when they're moving into an area that they are less familiar with. And this really happens when you're writing a grant in an area where you've read all the literature, but you don't know the cultural feelings about things. And this is a reason that it's always good, if you can, to have your grant read by a field expert, because they'll pick up the stuff that to you seem completely reasonable based on the literature, but they will know what everybody chatters about at conferences. Lack of expertise, as I mentioned, that you can have the best experimental design in the world, but if the reviewers don't think you can do it, you're toast. No description of the data analysis or statistics. So this is very dependent on field, but in some fields in particular, if they are not convinced your statistical approach is strong, if they're not convinced your power analysis is adequate, and particularly in clinical fields of folks who will be listening to this, these are serious poison pills. This can be less of a problem in my field, like in cell biology, because everything in my field is an N of 3, it seems. But particularly if you're doing large-scale population-based research, this data analysis and statistics is major. However, like in my field, particularly a common poison pill is that the application does not provide pitfalls or alternate approaches. So if, how can your data mislead you? How can the experiments not work? What are you going to do under those circumstances? And sometimes you can get this comment when you included the information, but you included it at the end, or you included it at the end of an aim instead of proximal to where you said the experiment. So sometimes I've seen grants where they'll get a comment back of no pitfalls or alternate approaches. And the reason is that you read through the specific aim, the experiments are being done, and there's basically no description of pitfalls or alternate approaches. The next experiment's being done, but then all of that is lumped at the very end of the aim. And because reviewers often don't read these things at the same time, they might not notice those pitfalls or alternate approaches. Also, this is part also of no data analysis, because sometimes people will say, we'll propose this experiment and never explicitly say what the result would look like if the hypothesis is correct. And again, this is a case where you have to tell the reviewers explicitly what this experiment is going to give you. Otherwise, you're taking the risk that it's going to be obvious to the reviewer, and it may not be. So it could be your experiment's great, it's going to give you the right answer, but you've thought about this for months or years, so you can see how that experiment's going to answer the question. That might not be obvious to a reviewer who spent 15 minutes reading that sub-aim. And if you don't tell the reviewer, you take the severe risk of them not understanding how your experiment is going to address the problem. Okay, so are there any questions up to this point? It's always hard when we're electronic. Okay. All right. So, however, this is
Dr.
all.
Duncan?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
It's Matt.
Hi, Matt. Hi, Matt. What's up?
I was just thinking about what you just said about the alternate approaches or the expected results in terms of where you put that in the grant.
Mm-hmm.
And I just wanted to ask a clarifying question.
Mm-hmm.
So would you advocate, not on the aims page, but in the research strategy, for example, as one describes the experiment or experiments for each aim, immediately following that should be expected results followed by alternate approach or pitfalls,
yes,
and then data
exactly.
analysis, rather than all in one section at the end of the grant?
Yes, that's exactly what I would recommend. The pitfalls and alternate approaches don't belong on the aims page. That's correct. But in the experimental design, for each experiment to go through this information, because if you leave it to the end, you're expecting the reviewer to do too much complex information mapping. But if you put it right after you introduce the experiment, that can be a lot more effective.
So just a quick follow-up. If one has done that, but also includes a paragraph or two at the end that talks about other limitations, is that just being redundant, or is that an opportunity to give other information?
Okay, so the very last paragraph shouldn't have anything negative in it. The very last.
No, not the very last one, but yeah.
It sort of depends. I'm thinking about your work, and it would not work as a structure for one of my grants to have an extra limitation section.
Sure.
I could imagine that if you were doing some social science research where that you are talking about the limitations of the particular experiment, then there's always going to be limitations in the overall study design that you might put at the end in a single place. But my work is kind of cell biology. Rob has a comment about that.
Hey, Matt, it's Rob. So I think part of that, I'm sitting sideways to the microphone, so hopefully you can hear me. Part of that is the study section you're going to and what those reviewers are used to seeing. And the program officers often have a good idea. So that's like a structural question, and taking a look at who's on the study section, maybe asking the program officer. But clinical investigators often expect to see something like that. Same with presentations. They expect to see, a conflict of interest statement at the beginning and limitations of the study at the end. Other realms of research, engineers never talk about that. They don't talk about the limitations, even though they sort of abound. So part of calibrating how you think about that structure is who's your audience, and that's something to keep in mind.
Yeah, I would emphasize that, actually. I just came back I go to the basic science meeting in my field all the time, and I just came back from the first clinical meeting I've ever gone to in my field. And the very last, like in a 10-minute talk, the last 2 minutes are basically ripping down why their study sucks.
Yeah.
And I found it kind of shocking. That's something that would never be done in my field, especially in an oral presentation. But it was absolutely clinical talk after clinical talk. The expectation was to find everything wrong with the study and point it out.
Okay, thanks, guys.
All right. So if there's no other questions, I'll move on. We good? Okay. So I talked about the experimental approach, but one thing that you have to understand is that as a applicant, you're always looking for the specific thing you can change to make it better or acceptable. I sent Erin a paper that is basically from the field of ecology. It's not medical research, but the title of it is, what if they're just not that into you?
Mm-hmm.
And even though the examples are ecological, I think it's really relevant for this group. Just not into you is that, I don't care. It's boring. And the thing to understand here is that the reviewers in your study section, they're charged with ranking many applications. And as a reviewer in the current funding climate, perhaps only one or two of the applications in their pile are going to get funded if they're assigned 8 to 10, which is pretty typical. So what this means is that there are many scientifically sound grants because applicants that aren't able to write a sound application scientifically, they're washed out of the system. If you write a whole bunch of terrible science that's badly written, they're never funded, people don't have jobs, and within a couple of years, they're gone. So this means the vast majority of applications coming into the study section, they're usually coming from established investigators, people who've been successful in the past. They're good, well-written grants. So what the reviewers are charged with isn't just to say, is the science sound? They're also charged to say, what is the most impactful? Which is going to move the science forward? So to make the pay line, to be funded, your work must be considered so exciting by those reviewers that they are willing to advocate it at the study section meeting to get the high enough score you need to make that magic pay line in that top 10 or 20% of grants, depending on where you are. And the thing about this that is particularly important about this comes from NIH just did a study where basically what they were trying to do is all NIH funding mechanisms are based on the predication that all study sections receive the same number of grants of equal quality. Now, among investigators, there's a lot of anecdotes that say some study sections read more high quality applications than others. So how they decided to study this was that they took funded applications from across study sections and they gave them to be reviewed by experienced grant reviewers. And I was one of the people that participated in that study. So I was given a group of 10 applications to review, and I was asked to rank them in relationship to where I would put them in a pay line. And in the end, there were grants I could look at, like one was from a Nobel laureate who had, published all these papers. And I will tell you, when I read this, I found it was the most god-awful, boring thing I have ever read in my life. And I did not give it a good score, even though I could objectively say it's probably good science, but I could care less about the area. And when they actually crunched the numbers, what they turned out is the biggest correlation between what we, as the people re-reviewing these grants, and that score was our familiarity with the science. So this is why you need to know who's on the study section. You need to have a pretty good idea of what study section your grant is going to. You should be looking at who are the permanent members of that study section and make sure you're writing it in such a way that the members of that study section will find that work exciting. Because the same grant going to a different study section is just going to find it really, really dull. And I've run into this problem as a reviewer again, because I've done my full term on a regular study section, which means I can't go back on one. But I get put on study sections as ad hoc members to review the grants of people who are on the current study section. And recently I was on one that was the cell biology study section instead of the ocular cell biology study section. And there was a really innovative, exciting grant that came into that study section. And that I was the only one that gave it a good score. And I was basically treated like, how dare I bring this grant up for discussion, because the permanent members of the study section had decided. and they found it boring because they didn't know it was important to this field of ophthalmic research. And so these are things that are that you have to understand that the reviewers might not be into you. And this is a really important thing, particularly if you just get this long list of seemingly trivial comments, things that most grants don't have to do, like well, this is another story, but in the old days, like validating your antibodies is not something you'd put in your grant. I say in the old days because there's a new, we now have to do it. But there's these trivial comments. You think that you're going to address all those and it will be fine. And it's that people were nitpicking you because they found your grant bleh, but they had to justify why they gave it a bleh score. And there are a lot of people who just won't write, this is boring. Mm-hmm. This is why I gave it the score. So they look for excuses to justify their score when the real problem is this is boring or uninteresting to the reviewer. Okay. This is another case where having a bunch of people read your critiques and your grant can be very helpful. It's also a case where contacting the program officer can sometimes be very helpful as well. All right. So why did those reviewers not care about your work when it was so obviously important and innovative? Presumably you wouldn't have written your grant if you didn't think it was obviously important and innovative. And the first thing I just want to say, and I can't emphasize this enough, are you sure you have not lost your objectivity? That in science, we get so wrapped up in what we're doing. We start getting excited about navel-gazing problems. Like, why did this experiment come out this way? Is not something that's going to be interesting to the field. It's interesting to you, but it's not interesting to the field. Also, is it something that is really going to change how people look at the field? Is it really going to give us new insight? Or is it just filling in details, which unfortunately, while filling in details is important, the field, since when you have limited funding, that doesn't get funded very much. And the second thing is that maybe it is really important and innovative, but did you not convey that to your reviewers because you spent so much time focused on studying the details? The reviewer lost track of why they should care about the details of the answer. This could be something like if you're putting a lot of emphasis on, like in my field, studying why the mouse mutant has a phenotype. And you're like, well, why does the mouse null for this gene have this phenotype? And you start getting into this circle of studying that problem and losing the bigger picture of understanding how that is actually going. Why does anybody care about that? Is it clinically relevant? Is it something that's going to tell you about the function of that gene in vivo? That you have to say these things explicitly. And like I just recently read a grant that was written by a colleague where that was exactly the problem. The work is interesting, important, and has a lot of clinical significance, but the writing puts so much emphasis on the detailed, that I'm studying this because of this other experimental result. You completely lost track of why you should care and why this could change treatment in this area. So this is a case where being empathetic can help, remembering what it was like not to understand your area, or just looking at somebody else's work. Would I really care about that kind of detail about someone else's work? Would that make me excited? And if not, try to present your own work in a way that somebody who is not familiar would find your work exciting and really worth advocating for publicly. Because if there's nothing there for them to advocate for, they will not do it because nobody wants to get shut down in a public debate about a grant. Okay. All right. So the other thing is that did you rely on that reviewer coming to the same conclusions that you did without a roadmap? And this is the very, very common phenomena of people writing their experimental approaches as an experiment vomit. Experiment, 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 but without any real roadmap to understand why is that experiment important? what is the data that experiment going to give? How does that refute or support the hypothesis? And people are often unrealistic. They forget that their hypothesis was 1 or 10 years of work to come up with. And then they expect the reviewer to come up with the same hypothesis or conclusions. So I often will tell people to imagine taking your reviewer by the nose and walk them through the logic linearly and logically, step by step. Another thing that grant writers often do is they'll provide a cloud of information. It's all there, but it can't be pieced together with a logical narrative. So just in the end, make sure there is a logical narrative that a naive reader can understand the logic of your study and how it will answer the question. Okay. All right. So at this point, hopefully you've achieved acceptance, saying, all right, I have dealt with my grief. I have figured out what the reviewers found so objectionable about my grant, or even what they didn't find objectionable. Because the thing about I'm just not that into you, it could be there's nothing wrong with your study at all. It's just that the reviewers find it blah. Maybe it ended up in the wrong study section or something. And the people reading it are not the right people to appreciate why the work is important. But at that point, you have to make an important decision, and that's to resubmit the application or not. And if you have a very poorly scored or unscored grant needing extensive revision, that this means that your grant was in the bottom 60% of your applications. That NIH has studied the statistics on this. The chances of an unscored grant moving into a funded grant on the single resubmission allowed to us is actually relatively low. Now, I'm not saying it's impossible. I personally have had a triage grant get funded on the next round. So it is not that it's impossible, but it's something that you should understand that the odds are against you if the first submission was unscored of it making the pay line on the next submission, particularly in institutes where that pay line is under 10%. So that you really need to decide whether it makes sense to send in an A1 or a first revision, or does it make more sense to simply submit the grant as a new application. With the new application, taking the reviewer comments into consideration. So this would be an extensive rewrite, revamping the application, refocusing the application, dealing with all of the reviewer concerns, but sending it in as a new grant. And this is something where it's highly recommended to have an objective, experienced reader look at the comments after reading the grant. And because you need that input, and the reason they don't find the work exciting, that you do not want this to be too good of a friend who is unable to provide you with constructive criticism, because too good of a friend will just say, oh, those reviewers are stupid. They don't appreciate how wonderful your work is. If somebody reads your reviews and comes back to you saying that, you need to find someone else. Because even though that is emotionally comforting, it is not helpful. So get that objective, experienced reader. Now, this may be a time where it's time to contact the program officer. Now, keep in mind, if your grant's triage, the program officer has nothing more in front of them than what you do, because that grant was not discussed, and they really did not hear any discussion that may tell you whether or not that grant should be resubmitted or not. They can maybe help you interpret the reviews, but it depends on the program officer. I've been doing science for 20 years, and all of my grants go to the same NIH study section. And over that time, I've had 2 different program officers. My first one, when I was an assistant professor, was incredibly unhelpful, and she was even nasty when you contacted her. And she's like, well, why are you asking me? That was absolutely her attitude. And she just wasn't helpful. In contrast, my current program officer is helpful. He tries to give you suggestions. He tries to help you interpret what those reviews say. And it really depends on who your program officer is. But I would encourage you to just contact the program officer if you can't figure this out, and they will give you their best guess. And they will tell you it's their best guess. But but if your program officer becomes one of the unhelpful ones, it is what it is. And you just have to go look for that advice from people in the field who are not on the study section. And I can't emphasize that enough, not on the study section. All right. So let's say that you're triaged and you decide to not resubmit. It doesn't mean you should kill the project. It just means that you were revamping the application enough. You're sending it in as a new application. And hopefully it'll be way better for the fact that it went through peer review once. However, let's say your grant was scored, or it was triaged, but the criterion scores are reasonably good, and everybody feels it's worth revising it. The thing that I cannot emphasize enough, never write a rebuttal to any sort of review, whether it be a paper or grant, when you are angry. And this is part of why I was talking about the stages of grief. If you are in the angry part of grief, that you will write a rebuttal that is snotty, sarcastic, and it will come across that way to the reviewers. And the reviewers, even if they want to be helpful, are just going to get annoyed. And even if it's not the same reviewers that reviewed your grant, if you write an uncharitable rebuttal, it'll come back to bite you. And I saw a new investigator torpedo their career when I was on study section, where the first reviews were decent. I think they got a 20th or 30th percentile. They wrote the rebuttal while angry. They clearly hadn't shown it to their mentors in their institution. And a grant that the study section felt, okay, you fix these things and we'll probably give it a good score next time, got triaged. And it was because they basically came in and said pretty bluntly that the reviewers have no vision, are stupid. I mean, it was over the top, and it torpedoed this guy's career because he needed to get his grant funded to keep his job. And the thing to understand is that it's not productive for you for that reason, but it's also not fair to the reviewers, because in my experience, reviewers for NIH grants are never stupid and very seldom unfair. And it's that these are successful people in the field. Grant review is largely on a volunteer basis. The $200 or $300 you get for doing it over and above your expenses does not even close to pay for the time of these highly knowledgeable people. And if you're volunteering your time, essentially, and somebody basically says that your work is subpar, stupid, or unfair, you're not going to feel very charitable towards them. So that's just human nature. One thing that I would emphasize is that you write your rebuttal, you really try to keep the anger or sarcasm out of it, but always have other people read that rebuttal for tone. This is something that's really, really important, because you could have internalized that sarcasm to the point that you can't see that you have wrote a snotty rebuttal. So absolutely look for tone in these things.
Can I add something to that? So one of the things that has helped me in the past is realizing that the reviewers they're really not trying to hurt you. They're actually trying to help you. And I think I've suggested this vision to some of the people that might be on the phone. I always picture them as they're just tired and they're a little cranky and they're trying to help. So you should thank them for what they did and explain how you're incorporating their suggestions into the review. Because failing to do that, you're really shooting yourself in the foot. And I've also seen that happen multiple times. And I've seen it happen on study section where I knew the junior person professionally, and they just came across as the biggest pain in the neck, ungrateful. and they got slammed. And I don't think that idea ever got funded. I think it was just done. So picturing the people, the reviewers are trying to help you, but they only have a little bit of time. They have their own jobs, their own families. They're taking time out to do this and trying to not burden them. That's a really smart way to go about it. Writing the grant also, but in particular, any rebuttal or introduction you have to do.
Yeah, reviewers don't get any time out of their day job to do this. I mean, we get a little bit of brownie points. It says it shows our national or international reputation, but it means that we're doing it over and above what we're paid to do. So, and so the thing about this is that you have to plan this introduction to the revised application very, very carefully. And the reason is this is one page only. By the reviews you receive are often 5-page or more of single-space text. Just as an example, I had a paper that I published over the summer where I got 4 pages of single-spaced reviews for the paper, and I sent in a 15-page single-spaced rebuttal to get that paper published, okay? And that was successful. But if that had been a grant, I couldn't have done that because you're not given 15 pages single-spaced to rebut the reviewer comments. You're given 1 page. Which means is that it's usually impossible to provide point-by-point responses to the reviewer comments. So when I was talking about going through what the reviewer comments were, trying to sort out what are the big picture problems with the grant, that's what you have to address in the introduction to the revised application, because you just will not have the room to do a point-by-point rebuttal. So this is, however, that said, you should, as Rob just said, always the first line of your rebuttal is to thank the reviewers for their time reviewing your prior proposal and their insightful comments. Even if you feel they are moronic idiots, you do not say that in your application. That you may not feel truly grateful about and you might truly not feel their comments are insightful, but you better still thank them and say nice things about the comments, because so even it sets the right tone. It means that the reviewer's like, okay, this person has internalized the criticism. It was constructive. Let's go forward. That you want to address the big picture things next in relationship to the impact of the work. Fundamentally, it's an impact factor for a reason. It is when they realign peer review, it was meant to have people think not just was the experiments well designed, but if that work was done, would it make an impact on the field? This is the point where if the reviewers aren't seeing why they should care about the project, it does not matter how well designed your study is. So if you can say things to make it clear to the reviewers that this work, if funded, is going to make a major impact on the field, put it right out there very, very obviously. Then you're going to want to address if there were any serious technical concerns, particularly if they were shared by multiple reviewers. Maybe they didn't like that you did a next-gen sequencing project. Maybe they didn't like your experimental design. Maybe all 3 reviewers were concerned that you would be able to recruit enough patients to be able to fulfill the power analysis necessary to do the study. Concerns like that need to be addressed in the rebuttal letter. And then finally, you want to make a comment about the structure of the revision and note how you made your changes. That sometimes if you have a major rewrite, but you're still resubmitting as a revised application, you can just say that you have put so much effort into revising this application, it's so different that individual changes will not be marked. Other cases, you're going to be rewriting sections and you're going to put a line in the left-hand margin showing these are the sections that were revised. If it's a very minor thing, let's say you just missed the pay line, sometimes people will underline the new text. So, but you need to tell the reviewers whether they should be looking for the changes you made marked in that text or not. Okay. So just as a wrap up, what I was saying is that you really need to get objective opinions on whether you want to resubmit or send in a new application. just because we know statistically that resubmissions have the best chance if the primary application was scored and scored relatively close to that pay line. You really need to analyze what the reviewers really felt were the important weaknesses. Sometimes that involves reading between the lines and figuring out if the problem wasn't all these nitpicking comments, but really is the reviewers just felt the study was blah and they didn't care about it that much. You want to address these things, prioritize addressing those problems in the revised application. You always want to have objective readers read the revised rebuttal page to make sure there's no sarcasm or even a slight hint of a lack of respect for the reviewers. And then another thing that you really want to do before you submit is double or even triple check that the changes you claim you made in the introduction really were made in the revised application. The reviewers will notice. It'll become really, really obvious if you say that you reworked an experiment in the introduction to the revised application and you did not in the body of the grant. It's actually easier to do than you may think, because often the specific aims page in the intro to the revised application are written separately to the actual body of the grant. And I've even seen cases where the specific aims and the specific aims page and in the body of the grant are different because one document has evolved while the other document did not. So it's very, very important to make sure that those three sections of the application, the intro to the application, the revised application, the aims page, and the body of the grant are completely congruent with each other. Similarly, if you had any letters of support, you want to get new letters of support that are dated very proximal to the new submission date. And you also want to make sure that if you change the actual written part of the application, all of the accessory pages are also congruent, such as if you change the mouse strains you're using, you want to make sure that that is addressed in the animal section. If you've changed the sites where you're recruiting patients, you want to make sure that is changed in the human subject section, and so forth and so on. It's because we're all busy, it's very, very easy to say, oh, I already have all of the extra materials written, I'll just change the application. But very often the extra materials directly influence what's in the application. You want to, again, make sure it's all consistent and congruent because it comes across as really obvious if this was done fast or sloppily. So I think that's all I have to say to you today. I'd be happy to take any other questions. If anybody's on who wants to ask questions. So if not, I will wrap things up. And if there's questions about, who to get to read or look at things, also, don't feel free to shoot me an email as well as Dr. Akins. Okay. So thank you very much.